My name is Michael DeBeyer, and I'm the Senior Instructional Designer at Bulletproof Solutions. I'm sometimes involved in vendor selection, vetting other junior instructional designers who we're going to work with. I'm involved in pricing discussions at times, and also I think beyond designing e-learning, I'm also play a sort of a consulting role with clients when they come to us with content that isn't quite ready for e-learning yet, or they have an idea about what they want, and we speak to them about sort of, which parts should be e-learning, which parts they might want to use for ILT. Why e-learning as opposed to ILT or some other mode of getting content out to their audience, and so on and so forth. 16 years in the business. The business has changed a lot. Yeah, if you think back to your early e-learning days, you've got a photo on the screen taking up a large portion of maybe half the screen, and you've got text right beside it, and you sort of click through it the way you would page down through a document until you hit a question, multiple choice question, you answered it, you moved on. Typically, yes, the greater the understanding the client has of the e-learning, of what e-learning can do, how it can help their staff or their target audience, then yes, it impacts, certainly an impact in terms of cost, because the client's usually starting from a better standpoint. And certainly, again, in terms of time, the expectations are going to be somewhat clearer to a client who's knowledgeable about the industry. I think there's a flip side to that too, when you have some clients who are knowledgeable enough to be resistant to alternate ways of doing things. So they may have had a lot of experience developing and learning back in 2003, and they've not really changed their model since then. And it might be a case where that becomes an impediment to updating the designs and updating the opportunities for their learners, and then that can be a hurdle. When you say 508, you actually mean Section 508. It's a set of standards that the United States government came up with that would dictate how web content is built so that that web content can be accessed by people who have who have disabilities of some kind. So the idea is that a blind person, surfing a website is going to have a comparable experience to somebody who is sighted surfing the same website. Section 508 is the most common form that I deal with because it's federally mandated in the United States. Other international standards like the Web Content Accessibility Platform, or WCAG, are very, they're very comparable in terms of what they demand. I think if you're talking about broad-scale internet use, then there probably are some dissimilarities. When it comes to e-learning and sort of the net results of either accessibility guideline, the result is roughly the same. I think you'd be splitting hairs to separate the two in any real way in the e-learning world. No, they probably wouldn't be, unless by some chance they had prior experience. But no, they might be familiar with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but possibly not. I mean, the fact is, like Section 508 comes up a lot because it's federally mandated. So all federal websites in the United States have to have, all state websites, any sort of governmental body has to produce all of its web content following Section 508. Unless an organization sees the need, a big enough company has the need, and they recognize over some long-standing HR policy that they need to make all their content accessible, then they might pick up on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I'd say more often than not, what happens with these large organizations is rather than rather than creating a truly accessible e-learning product, they will come up with alternative, I'm doing air quotes here, you can't see, alternative accessible solutions. So for example, if I make an hour-long e-learning course that has a lot of interactivity in it and a lot of animation and a lot of things that would be really difficult to duplicate in an accessible version, the client will come up with basically a text-based version equivalent. So all of the content's still relayed, but without all the interactivity and entertainment value and things like that that were in the e-learning product. It's not many clients that are insisting on accessible content. They look for alternatives. Yes, the e-learning provider should have some understanding of what it means to build an accessible piece of training. Let's have that discussion before we begin the design phase. The design phase would occur after we've already got some content, we've already got some idea of what the client's looking for. Let's have the conversation before we begin doing design. And the reason for that is that the way a course is designed, including the kinds of interactivity, the kinds of, just any elements that you're planning on including, the cost of the whole thing will be impacted by whether or not it's going to be accessible. A typical 508 course is self-paced, and that means that all of the control for how the e-learning moves forward is in the learner's hands. And so they're only going to be seeing one element of content on the screen at a time. And when they click the forward arrow typically, or if they tab to the forward arrow, then the screen progresses. A lot of times clients would rather see running animation on the screen. But that's a challenge for some learners who who have difficulty processing material that's running by them quickly. So it's got to be self-paced. That comes up commonly as a complaint about 508 learning. A lot of the courses we make are audio driven. So as the audio proceeds, so the screens change and animations occur and whatnot along with it. So it's the pace again that the audio sets that is something of a challenge. There you can have a course V-padded, and that is basically a certification that the course is accessible according to Section 508. If you're a company that is concerned about inclusivity, and certainly if you make a big deal about how inclusive your company is, then you definitely want to be considering 508. And that could be, if your training is going to be for the public, if you're training your public on how to use something that you manufacture, then you almost certainly want to go with something that is going to be accessible, providing it's realistic. I think it's the trade-off between inclusivity and wanting to get to make a piece of entertainment for the rest of the target audience, or something that's a little bit flashier and more interactive and potentially more engaging. It's a trade-off. Yes, we have. Generally speaking, I would discourage that. Certainly, if you have to have a product V-padded at the end of development, you can't go halfway. I think what common experience is, you get into the production cycle, we try to make a point of making the client aware of whatever the 508 or WCAG restrictions are going to be. We want to make them aware of that as early as possible. Oftentimes, the client reacts to that and says, well, can't we just do this? Or is there some other alternative to this? And there are alternatives out there. My own, my personal impression on it is that if you want to make your content accessible, it should be accessible for everybody. And the hinge on which clients might decide to make different calls is the hinge is the comparable experience. So what is a comparable experience? Well, if you swing the door wide enough, you can come up with a comparable experience that really isn't comparable. It's our responsibility to make our clients as aware as possible about what the limitations, and I've described them as limitations and restrictions, but what those are when they come to build accessible courseware. And we'll do everything we can. We'll give you, we'll explain what everything means. We'll give you samples to look at and understand. It's a matter of you just have to be prepared for it, so that when you get it, you weren't expecting something that wasn't really promised within that set of limitations.